After part 1 of The Witcher Season 3 gave us a middling display, it was the most positive that I had felt about the show since the first season. Part 1 wasn't good, but it wasn't terrible like Season 2 and Blood Origin. I was hopeful that part 2 of Season 3 could potentially continue what little momentum part 1 had built up. Unfortunately, part 2 has the show's biggest flaws on full display, leading to a disjointed viewing experience that drags down the season as a whole. Despite featuring one of the biggest battles of the series to date, with character interactions and confrontations that have been long awaited, part 2 fails to give these moments the necessary time and care for them to have the impact that they intended. With the season's climax coming in episode 6, the final 2 episodes feel underwhelming, serving more as a setup for a future season than to pay off the narrative set up in the previous episodes. Where part 1 was mid, I think part 2 is bad. With that said, I will be taking an in-depth look at The Witcher Season 3 Part 2, going over each of the 3 episodes in detail. Spoilers ahead.
You will never take.
Despite serving as the season's climax and featuring a massive battle set piece, I think episode 6 might be the worst episode of the season. With all of part 1 building up to the events of this episode, the quality of the season really rested on its shoulders. As if it was well told and captivating, the audience would walk away feeling satisfied. Similarly, if it was poorly told, all of the season's flaws would feel amplified, as the narrative's conclusion would serve to highlight the show's poor storytelling. Unfortunately, as I already mentioned, I think this episode failed, and ended up hurting the season as a whole. We pick up in the episode exactly where we left off in part 1, with Dijkstra holding a sword to Geralt, and telling him he should have picked a side. It turns out that Redania has led a coup and are rounding up members of the Brotherhood for what they call a purge. They are being aided by members of the Brotherhood, like Sabrina and Kira, because, well, we don't really know why they're helping. They just are. We have no idea what information they know when they decide to join Redania or what their ultimate goal is. Due to this lack of information, their involvement feels disorienting, as the audience tries to understand why these characters are making these decisions. This is one of the largest issues in the episode, as the audience is left wondering, why is anyone doing what they're doing? When we finally reach the battle, it feels just like a bunch of random things are happening. Why does Dijkstra tell Geralt that Redania took Ciri? What does he have to gain from antagonizing him with this information? A broken leg and an ass kicking? Why would he want that? I mean, I guess he is kinda into pain. Why didn't they cuff Tissaia when they cuffed everyone else, including Vilgefortz, who would have likely fought back now that the jig is up? The reason they give us is because...
Why wasn't she secured? Because I told them I would melt their faces if they touched me.
But the real reason is that they need Tissaia free so that she can break out everybody else. It's the same reason that when she clearly starts to use magic to free them, the Redanians just stand around and let her do it. After being freed, Vilgefortz lets the elves in, but not before breaking up with Tissaia and telling her that she was only ever a side piece. The elves face off against the sorcerers of the Brotherhood, something that should be hype, but just feels a little hollow. Especially when the mages that were helping Redania ditch their armbands and pretend like they weren't going to purge the other mages. The battle is a lot of things happening, but it all means very little. As a viewer, in order to get invested in an extended fight sequence, it's important to understand why things are happening. What are the characters' motivations? What are the circumstances of the fight? And what are the stakes of winning and losing? Unfortunately, this fight is very much an undisclosed number of mages fighting an undisclosed number of elves, with it being hard to distinguish what is really going on. It's a chaotic mess that is hard to follow, as the show just throws things out, hoping they will be cool or interesting enough to distract the audience from the lack of substance. Among the chaotic list of things that happen throughout the fight are Filavandrel getting turned into fruit punch, some dude getting bodied by an owl, 2 goobers joining their swords together so that they can fight more awkwardly, Triss standing in a doorway so that she can get hit by an arrow, Istrid getting banished into the Shadow Realm, and Tissaia turning into a granny as she does her best Palpatine impression. It's just a bunch of nonsense. One of the things I found most annoying was when characters would just appear out of nowhere. After Filavandrel is exploded, a wild Fringilla appears out of thin air to kill her uncle and act like he had it coming. Last time we saw Fringilla, she was getting drunk off her ass and partying, and all of a sudden she appears in the middle of the fight in some fancy new duds. The show tried to set up her arrival in part 1 when she asks about the boat, but I don't feel like it does enough to justify Fringilla showing up here without seeing anything else. It's weird too, because when she shows up, she starts talking to Cahir about how he should think for himself and be free.
I'm simply no longer confined, Cahir. You know, it is amazing what you can do when you think for yourself.
And it's like, aren't you essentially doing Amir's bidding right now? Who are you to talk? Strigobor performs a similarly disjointed appearing act. He pops up and joins the fight, and I couldn't help but think, wasn't he supposed to be locked up or something after the previous night's events?
I propose Strigobor is held until the conclave concludes and we can have a full trial.
Did someone free him, or did he just escape? It just feels sloppy and leaves the audience grasping at straws to try and understand what's going on. Another issue is that I feel some of the locale was confusing, as I found it difficult to understand where the environments were in relation to each other. What I mean by this mostly has to do with the outside scenes. Ciri wakes up early and leaves the cabin to try and find Yennefer. When Jaskier realizes that she is gone, he immediately starts looking for her, but kind of just disappears. We see Ciri running through the woods, then reach this rocky pathway by the ocean side where she finds Yennefer. They then wander around for a little bit before finding Rience, who is finally killed by Geralt, which should have happened in episode 1. Maybe it was just a me thing, but I just found it hard to understand where they were in relation to Aretuza and the cabin. The characters seem to move as quickly or slowly as the plot demands, as seen by Ciri and Yen getting back to Aretuza quickly, whereas Jaskier doesn't arrive until the next episode. Once Yen leaves to help Tissaia, Geralt and Ciri are confronted by Cahir, giving us another bizarre exchange. These two characters meeting was something I was actually excited for, given how Ciri has built up dread and a hatred for Cahir, and how Cahir has been having these visions of Ciri. What we get is Cahir offering to let Ciri kill him for what he has done to her, instead of trying to capture her and bring her to Emhyr, like he has been ordered to do. I felt that eventually Cahir would turn on Emhyr, but this moment feels a bit premature, and like Cahir's character development needed to cook a little longer before this should be happening. It's also weird, as once he sees a group of elves approaching, Cahir leaves, saying he will buy Ciri some time and that he will find her again. So when Cahir goes to try and find Ciri again later, it's so that she'll kill him?
My life is yours, so take it. I will find you.
Just seems weird. Also, Cahir does his best Jon Snow impression, which feels pretty weak by comparison. The Geralt of Vilgefortz 1v1 that we get is decently compelling, and probably the best part of the episode, but it is still not without some faults. It's a fun looking fight scene and has some genuine stakes as they are fighting over the fate of Ciri. Geralt gets dominated in a way that we have never seen before, which should fill the audience with dread at Vilgefortz's power. My only issues with this fight were that I felt like Vilgefortz should have used his magic a bit more, as the only reason I felt like Geralt had a chance at all was because Vilgefortz let him get in close quarters, instead of keeping him at a range. Also, why didn't Vilgefortz kill Geralt? He has him dead to rights, so why not finish the job? Ciri's playing with the monolith, getting pulled into it and yeeted elsewhere as the tower's explosion gives Vilgefortz his membership card to the Half-Face Club. Overall, this episode was so chaotic that it felt hard to get invested in what was actually happening. It's very sloppily done, which robs the season of a satisfying climax.
Geralt!
This episode is almost entirely centered on Ciri and her trek through the desert. Similar to how I felt about the party episode, I feel like this episode is an interesting idea in theory, but the execution left something to be desired. Having a character isolated and lost, wandering through the desert is a great opportunity to explore that character in a new and interesting way. We can see their ups and downs as they try to beat the elements and hold on to their sanity in the process. I don't think this episode did a terrible job of this, but I think its pacing was slightly off as it started to drag near the tail end. If this concept didn't work for you, then it's a bit of a snooze fest, as nothing really happens. We start the episode by finding out that Ciri has been dumped by the monolith on a Tatooine lookalike.
You love Sand Planet.
Something that I think the show does pretty well is immediately adding an element of intrigue by having a hooded figure appear in the background, seemingly haunting Ciri's every move. I think it does a decent job of creating an eerie feeling, but I would have liked for the show to play a bit more into that, with Ciri getting increasingly paranoid about being followed. Ciri experiences some visions as she sees her mother and grandmother. These encounters are meant to try and have Ciri and the audience guess if they are just hallucinations as a result result of food and water deprivation, or if there's something more to them. I think that they're the work of this Falca spirit as a means of manipulating Ciri and to help lead her to her low point at the end of the episode. I think this idea of trying to figure out how much of what Ciri is experiencing is real and how much of it is an illusion is an element that I wish the show played with a bit more. After she first meets the unicorn, she doesn't touch it.
No touching, understood.
And when she follows it over the hill, it doesn't leave any footprints. Are these meant to be clues to the audience that it was a hallucination? Or was the lack of footprints just bad writing and staging? You never can tell with a show like this. Regardless, I think this moment and the effect is interesting and has the audience questioning what they are seeing. Ciri meets the unicorn after coming across some thick water and almost getting eaten by the Sarlacc pit. The unicorn gives her the heads up, allowing her to jump out of the way just in time. Every time the unicorn was on screen, I found myself getting distracted, as Homeboy was walking around with a set of boulders between his legs. Seriously, every time the unicorn is on screen, his massive balls are just swinging away. It's distracting, especially in the scene where the unicorn leads Ciri to water, and while she is drinking, the unicorn's huge balls are just behind her head in the background. Now maybe I'm the weirdo and no one else noticed this, but when there's nothing really going on in the episode, those unicorn balls swinging like a pendulum are the most interesting thing on screen. I actually feel like Freya Allan gives a really good performance in this episode, which is important because she is forced to carry it. I think she does a good job showing Ciri's increasing desperation as she wanders the desert and questions her own sanity. One of the things that hurts this episode is that it is only one of 3 episodes released in part 2. It takes place after a very unsatisfying climax. I feel like if it took place earlier in the season, it would work better, as it feels like it's the start of Ciri's own personal adventure. As it is, it feels tacked on at the end of the season where the audience was expecting big things and story resolutions. I think the ending where Ciri relinquishes her powers seems to be the most important thing that comes out of this episode and will have a big role to play in what's to come. I think this might be the best episode in part 2 of season 3, as I think there are some things to like here, even if it dragged at times.
The old guard is gone. It's up to us. We decide how we move forward.
I think one of the reasons part 2 of season 3 is so disappointing is because of the story structure the show chose to employ.
One of the big decisions we made is to place it in the middle of our season, not at the end. And that's because if you're saying that there's a huge event that changes everything, you need to start to see how it changes things.
By immediately having the season's climax in episode 6, episodes 7 and 8 are both cooldowns, setting up for the next season rather than bringing this season to its conclusion. Having a cooldown episode for a season finale is not something that is completely unheard of in television, as Game of Thrones famously did this to great effect. The climax of the season would occur in episode 9, and the finale served to chill the audience out a bit so that the last thing they saw of the characters wasn't murder and destruction. I don't think it works nearly as well though in the case of The Witcher season 3, because of the way the season was released, as well as the fact that it is 2 cooldown episodes rather than 1. Episodes 7 and 8 feel less like a part of season 3, and more like episodes 1 and 2 of season 4. But this is the way the show chose to go, and as a result, episode 8 is a bit disappointing. We follow a number of storylines throughout the episode, as the show tries to set up the next phase of what's to come. The Geralt storyline sees our favorite Witcher near death and crippled, brought to a place to help heal him. They don't do a very good job of it though, as it seems like most of the progress that Geralt makes comes from being healed by Yen when she visits a little bit later on. It begs the question as to why didn't Triss and the other mages just heal him when they found him.
I thought Triss would have healed you.
Geralt spends the majority of the episode trying to recover from his injuries. This brings me to another reason why a lot of fans were disappointed in part 2 and the season at large, and that is the lack of involvement from Geralt. Even though he is the main character of the show, it felt like to many that Geralt was being sidelined for much of the season as other characters were put in the spotlight. For people who only watch the season to get their final fill of Henry Cavill, the lack of meaningful screen time for Geralt left them feeling like they shouldn't have even bothered to watch it. With Geralt not being much of a focus in episode 6 except for his fight with Vilgefortz, barely appearing in episode 7, and spending most of the finale injured and trying to recover, many were let down by the lack of Geralt in part 2. It doesn't help that a lot of his screen time in the finale is marred by a new character named Milva, who I found to be incredibly annoying.
Ask the wrong question, they will string you up. And then how would we have these lovely daily chats.
She's meant to be this sassy, straight-talking character, but I really did not like her. It's clear they're building her up to be a recurring character going forward, but I have no interest in getting to know her. She spends most of her time being sassy to Geralt.
Very weird energy between you two.
And when they teased her backstory a bit, I find myself thinking,
I don't want to hear it.
The end of her storyline sees the aftermath of the battle. Tissaya's heartbroken about what happened, feeling responsible for the dead because of her support for Vilgefortz.
Everything she loved, everything she cared about, everything she believed in has been left in ruins. And she feels inherently responsible for it.
I think her despair makes sense, as her actions directly led to a lot of the death and turmoil that occurred, especially considering that she was the one who freed Vilgefortz. She feels foolish and like she could never possibly make amends for her mistakes. The final scene that she shares with Yennefer I think is really well acted, as we once again see just how much these two care for each other, as Yen tries to get Tissaia to rally, while Tissaia is quietly defeated. One thing that bothered me though, is how the scene starts with Tissaia being hyper-focused on troop movements, showing that she is existing to make things right, and will work for that goal at any personal cost to herself. This stands in direct contrast to her taking her own life, so I'm not really sure why Tissaia was so interested in troop movements if she was just going to kill herself. As for the death itself, as soon as Tissaia told Yen she would be down in a minute, I knew she was going to commit Sudoku. I feel like it was done well enough. It didn't have much of an emotional impact for me, but I could see it having a bigger impact for others. Tissaia's death leaves a power vacuum, as all of the old guard of the Brotherhood are gone. This leads Yen and her new group of mages to step up and fill their shoes, setting up for what's to come. However, before the season ends, Yen goes to visit Geralt, telling him of what she must do. The two realize that they will be separated yet again, and Yen wants him to promise that they will see each other again. And while I'm sure she will see Geralt again, it's just that when she does, he'll be looking a little bit different. In Redania, we see Dijkstra and Philippa scheming, but this time, Vizimir is not happy with their recent performance. As soon as he said that Philippa would have to pay for the mistake, I knew he was toast, especially as the show made it a point to show that he was overheard by Bad Haircut, and it is Bad Haircut that is the one to kill him. Honestly, Philippa's plan here is so sloppy and entirely too dependent on being able to control Radovid. Radovid knows from earlier in the season that Dijkstra and Philippa killed Queen Hedwig to serve their own purposes. He also knows that his brother had pretty much just ordered for Philippa to be executed, and now all of a sudden, he's murdered. Radovid should be able to figure out that Dijkstra and Philippa killed his brother, so what is stopping him from arresting and executing the two as soon as that blood-covered crown touches his head? He seemed horrified when he learned about Hedwig being killed, so why would he have any loyalty to Dijkstra and Philippa? Also, when Ciri was being brought to Emir, it was so obviously a fake when we didn't immediately see her face. It does beg the question of how did Vilgefortz find fake Ciri, as she was hidden in Geralt's friend's cabin, but I don't think the show wants us to ask that question.
Look around, it's all gone. Forget this. Salvage what you can for The Witcher.
Overall, Season 3 Part 2 of The Witcher was a massive disappointment, as it was an incoherent mess which made it difficult for the audience to get invested in anything that was happening. The structure the show decided to employ for Part 2 also minimizes any merits Episodes 7 and 8 would have had. Part 2 was some poor quality storytelling that dragged down the season as a whole. Unfortunately for The Witcher, even if Part 2 was a masterpiece, there would still be a ton of questions surrounding the show heading into Season 4, with the departure of Henry Cavill and the seemingly constant swirl of toxicity that surrounds it. At this point, Geralt's broken and battered body after his bout with Vilgefortz is the perfect representation for the state of the show. I enjoyed the first season of The Witcher, and would give it a high 7 to low 8. Season 2 was terrible, and I'd probably give it a low 3. Season 3 is probably a low 4 for me, dragged down from the 5 range by a poor Part 2. I've seen that generally speaking, the ratings are much lower for Season 3 than they are for Season 2, but I think this has less to do with Season 2 being a better season, and more to do with the overall feelings about the show currently in the fandom. For many people, Season 3 is where The Witcher ends for them. Despite a promising first season, it has been marred in controversy, poor writing decisions, and lost its main star. It is clear now that Netflix's adaptation will never reach the heights that so many fans hoped when the series was first announced. It almost doesn't matter if the show is somehow able to turn things around in future seasons, as for many, the show will forever be tainted. If you somehow made it to the end of the video, I want to thank you for watching. If you liked the video, I would really appreciate if you liked and subscribed. It really helps out the channel. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.